Good morning, and thank you for joining me on the path to liberty. I'm Michael Bolden with the 10th Amendment Center, and this is the Fast Friday edition of the show for December 1st, 2023. And if you're like me, your social media feeds over the last few days have been literally filled to the brim with video clips of Elon Musk telling boycotting advertisers to, well, GFY. He's not going to be manipulated or bribed into submission. And you can love the guy, you can hate the guy, you can not care. But what's important about that, and especially since so many people are talking about it, I wanted to highlight this as well, I think is the attitude. It's incredibly important for taking on the largest government in history. And I know some people over the years have taken the position when we put out a message like this that, whoa, dude, that's going too far. You got to show these people some at least respect of the office. That's out of line. But in response to the largest government in history, the entity that claims power over virtually every aspect of our lives, when it's not supposed to be doing that, I mean, they claim the power over what kind of light bulbs we could have, how much water we're going to have in our toilets, what kind of plants we can grow in our own backyard and consume in our home, and what kind of tools we can use for our natural right of self-defense. These people don't deserve respect, in my opinion. But here's James Otis Jr., who put it this way: when our rights are invaded, it is high time to throw aside prudence. And when I think of most of their so-called acts, laws, rules, regulations, and orders that have been on the books, whether it's today or for decades and decades, most of them shouldn't exist. And it reminds me of Thomas Jefferson's great quote, "Law is often but the tyrant's will, and always so when it violates the rights of the individual." Man, that is absolutely timeless stuff. So how do you deal with that? And surprisingly, I want to cite Alexander Hamilton from Federalist number 33. Of course, he said whatever he needed to say for the audience in front of him to get what he wanted. So he probably wasn't even on board with this. But maybe he certainly was a flip-flopper. But the message is what's important here. He's talking about the Supremacy Clause and points out that acts of the large society which are not pursuant to its constitutional powers will be merely acts of usurpation and will deserve to be treated as such. The word usurpation is important. This is how the founding generation, the old revolutionaries, described acts that are not authorized or delegated to the government. Arbitrary power, for example. If we think of the grievances, listed grievances in the Declaration of Independence, Jefferson in the text actually called them injuries and usurpation. So when they go beyond their limits, we're supposed to treat them as a usurpation of power. Either that means it needs to be resisted or completely disregarded. And when it comes to principles of the American Revolution, there were not too many people who were more influential on the old revolutionaries than a guy named Algernon Sidney. And here's how he put it: "That which is not just is not law, and that which is not law ought not to be obeyed." Not only do they deserve to not be obeyed when they go beyond the limits of their delegated powers, they ought not to be obeyed as well. Now, Thomas Jefferson, when he was talking about what he was trying to do with the Declaration of Independence, he pointed out that this was not an effort to find out new principles, but instead he was trying to put pen to paper and put together an expression of the American mind. And he highlighted the fact that he was drawing on people like Locke, of course, Cicero, of course, and a guy that most people don't hear about today, Algernon Sidney. And the book that was published after he was executed for merely writing something, keeping it at home and not publishing it. So he was a martyr to liberty, to the founding generation, to the old revolutionaries. He was a hero to the revolutionaries. His book, Discourses Concerning Government, Thomas Jefferson considered it the best book which has ever been published, elementary book on government founded in natural law, natural rights in any language. So that's a pretty good 5-star review. That will be linked to in the show notes. Alan Mosley puts that together for us. Very grateful for Alan's work here at TAC. And we'll get that published over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty in the next couple hours after this live stream is done. Anyway, so this whole idea of not obeying usurpations of power, defying government all the time, this is a tool to keep them in check. This permeated the entire revolution. When I talk about the revolution, of course, we know that the revolution happened before the war even started. The revolution was a radical change in the viewpoints of the people, either depending on who you're talking to, usually people like John Adams, it would have been like 1760, 1761. People in Virginia may have looked at 1764, 1765 as the beginning, but it was a radical change in the viewpoints of the people before the shot heard around the world in 1775. It happened before the War for Independence even started. And one of the places where this was very prominent was in Patrick Henry's Virginia Resolves Against the Stamp Act. And here on May 29th, 1765, he had just been elected to the House. He was going it alone. They did not like what he was doing. But here's a couple of pieces from that. Resolved that His Majesty's liege people, the inhabitants of this colony, are not bound to yield obedience to any law or ordinance whatever, designed to impose any taxation whatsoever upon them, other than the laws or ordinances of the General Assembly aforesaid. In many ways, Patrick Henry is the original Tenther, the original 10th Amendment guy. And of course, there was no 10th Amendment at the time, but it was the principle of a line in the sand. General stuff belonged to the far-off government, Parliament, and the more specific stuff that directly affected the lives and liberties of the people could only be done if the people wanted them to by their own local assembly, their General Assembly there in Virginia. Anyway, so that, first of all, he's taking the position that no one's bound to yield obedience to unconstitutional, illegal acts. And I know some people will say, you can't say unconstitutional, but the founding generation referred to the British Constitution as a unwritten constitution as, well, a constitution, and acts of the British Parliament as unconstitutional. Side note. He goes further. He says, resolved that any person who shall by speaking or writing assert or maintain that any person or persons other than the General Assembly of this colony have any right or power to impose or lay any taxation on the people here shall be deemed an enemy to this His Majesty's colony. So we're talking about that GFY attitude. Dear government people, go to hell, is Patrick Henry's approach here in 1765. And we know Jefferson was in the audience there, and I'm sure he got influenced for his Kentucky resolutions of 1798 many decades later. But certainly think of the attitude there. Not only is he saying no one's bound to yield obedience, but even if you take the side that people should, that they are authorized to do the stuff that they're not authorized to do, you are an enemy of the people. You are an enemy of liberty. And if you think of all the people who advocate for all kinds of unconstitutional garbage today, there's a lot of enemies of the Constitution. There's a lot of enemies of liberty that we have to face right now. But this is the attitude that we're talking about that really is truly missing. John Hancock had the same approach, same kind of mentality. This is in a letter to his London agent, Jonathan Bernard, just weeks before the Stamp Act was going to go into effect. He said, the people of this country will never be made slaves of by a submission to the damned act. It's this, again, the attitude we aren't going to bend a knee. There's unlimited submission, or there's passive compliance, obedience. Well, James Otis Jr. will do much better on this quote than I will. He that would palm the doctrine of unlimited passive obedience and non-resistance upon mankind is not only a fool and a knave, but a rebel against common sense, as well as the laws of God, of nature, and his country. James Otis Jr., if you're going to say, hey, you just got to comply and then somehow convince the government to stop doing what the government was never supposed to do in the first place, this is in essence unlimited submission, because you are waiting for government to just tell you, sorry, we made a mistake. Even John Locke, who didn't really get deep into the woods on this, in my opinion, I'm not an expert on Locke's work, but I definitely have read through it a bit. Here from his two treatises: when anyone or more shall take upon them to make laws, whom the people have not appointed so to do, they make laws without authority, which the people are not therefore bound to obey. Again, if the people are the top of the food chain in the American system, in any system, and the people have delegated power through their Constitution, as James Wilson put it this way, as our constitutions are superior to our legislatures, so are the people superior to the Constitution. So that's the order of things. People through Constitution, and then various governments. And this is a very Lockean position, that they're only authorized to do those things that the people have determined that they're authorized to do. And if they go beyond that, they're not bound to obey them. And I think Sydney is a little more hardcore, and I like that. They ought not to be obeyed. But anyways, Locke continues, by which means they come again to be out of subjection and may constitute to themselves a new legislative, as they think best, being in full liberty to resist the force of those who without authority would impose anything upon them. Again, they're not bound to obey them, and they also have the right to resist the force of any acts that the government is not authorized to implement. And this mentality was certainly carried forward in the ratification debates over the Constitution in 1787, 1788. James Madison, I think I most prominently highlight from Federalist number 46. He said, how do you deal with a federal government that does unwarrantable stuff, unconstitutional? Or for Madison, even if it does warrantable but unpopular stuff, he recommended a refusal to cooperate with officers of the Union for states and individuals. And he said if a bunch of states did the same thing, and again, states doesn't just mean state governments, it's the people comprising those political bodies, those societies. If a bunch of them do this same thing, this refusal to cooperate with officers of the Union, it would present obstructions which the federal government would hardly be willing to encounter. In other words, the government, without support of the people in the states, is not going to be able to implement its stuff. Or even more aggressive, here's Archibald McLean in the, I believe, Virginia Ratifying Convention. Do I have that right? Archibald McLean. I'm just having a little brain fart here. He said, how should we respond to government? I got to look this up. Where did Archibald McLean come from? Archibald McLean. Where was he? Archibald McLean. North Carolina Ratifying Convention. Wow, I should have this down by now, but every now and then I'll screw it up. But here's Archibald McLean. He's saying, hey, what do we do when they go beyond their limits? How should we respond? And he said, this is what we should do. We should respond to them by saying, you cannot exceed the power prescribed by the Constitution. We will disregard it and punish you for the attempt. So again, when they go beyond their limits, it has to be treated as a usurpation. And like Hamilton was saying in Federalist 33, but also what Sidney was saying. And here's McLean saying, we're going to disregard it and then go further, punish you for the attempt. St. George Tucker had a similar take in his view of the Constitution of the United States, published in 1803. He said, acts of Congress to be binding must be made pursuant to the Constitution. Otherwise, they are not laws, but a mere nullity, or what is worse, acts of usurpation. So again, usurpation, they are not laws, they're just stuff that they put on paper. But how do you deal with it? He said the people are not only not bound by them, but the several departments and officers of the governments, both federal and state, are bound by oath to oppose them. For being bound by oath to support the Constitution, they must violate that oath whenever they give their sanction by obedience or otherwise to any unconstitutional act of any department of the government. And I can't have a conversation like this without citing Lysander Spooner's great defense, a defense for fugitive slaves in 1850. And here's one part of it. If you haven't read this one yet, you really got to do it. It'll be linked to in the show notes. It's free over at Liberty Fund, and it's got a ton of great strategic advice and insight. But Spooner put it this way: to say that an unconstitutional law must be obeyed until it is repealed is saying that an unconstitutional law is just as obligatory as a constitutional one, for the latter is binding only until it is repealed. He said there would therefore be no difference at all between a constitutional and an unconstitutional law in respect to their binding force, and that would be equivalent to abolishing the Constitution and giving to the government unlimited power. Ultimately, if you continue to comply with stuff that's unconstitutional, and you're waiting for the government to determine if the government violated the rules given to the government by the people of the several states, then government does, as Jefferson put it as well in 1798 in his Kentucky resolutions, that is giving them unlimited power. Benjamin Franklin sums it up best: make yourselves sheep and the wolves will eat you. So as long as you continue to beg government to do the right thing, whether it's through whatever strategies people use, protesting or voting bums out or going to federal courts in the hopes that the federal judges will somehow tell another part of the federal government that the federal government broke the rules given to the federal government, that's acting like a sheep. That's population on its knees begging for scraps, and you're not going to get much. Make yourself sheep, and the wolves will eat you. And Jefferson may have summed it up best. Thomas Jefferson here. A free people claim their rights as derived from the laws of nature and not as the gift of their chief magistrate, or not as a gift of their chief magistrate. Well, I hope you guys found this interesting. I hope it was educational, more important than anything. I hope you learned something. If you want to help me celebrate my birthday today, hint, hint, nudge, nudge. One of the best things you can do, of course, to help us spread this word and help me celebrate a little bit today is to join us as a member over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. For as little as $2 a month, we also have annual, 5-year, and lifetime options. You can help us take a stand for the Constitution and liberty, whether the government likes it or not, and I guarantee you, they don't like it. No pressure, but I really appreciate any consideration you can give to joining us today. Again, 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. Thank you so much for watching the show. I hope you have an awesome weekend. I hope you enjoyed this episode, and I hope to see you next week here on the Path to Liberty.